busy. But the big thing about this, and we saw this when we talked about, what was the big? We had the big meeting of the big three in the Crimean. What was that called in February? Yeah, Yalta. And so the war was still going on. You can see that the Great Alliance against Hitler was breaking apart. And that all the old fears and insecurities were coming out. And one thing we got to get before we talk about the fears, both the United States and the Soviet Union come out of this war as the two strongest powers. Both were very ignorant about each other. They didn't really understand how either country worked, the motivations, what drove Stalin or drove the United States. They didn't understand that. And so what we got to get is so many of their fears are out of ignorance. And there's something about this. If you fear somebody and you're ignorant, you don't know about them, you can't empathize with them, you don't know what their point of view is, what their motivations, and you're scared of them, it becomes very easy to interpret everything they do as some kind of sinister action. Oh, they're whispering about me, they're talking about me, they're doing something against me. And so you're going to get this where you're going to look at every action as part of their plan. That's how they're going to get me. Now, I know we're above that in here. But other people outside of here, they act like that too. They see people and they get that little paranoid thing, oh, they're talking about me. No, we aren't like that. I mean, everyone is out to get us, but that's just because they're jealous. Yeah, they're jealous of us. But you see that all the time with people who immediately assume there's some kind of sinister reason for they do it and totally misinterpret it. So American fears, and by the way, I love this one. That's what we call subtle. Gah! Then the Stalin octopus. But the U.S. has always hated and feared communism. So we know that. We know that. And remember the bomb-throwing anarchists, or the Red Scare right after World War I. And communism represented the unknown. There's something about communism that scared people, not just because they beat the Germans and it must be 10 feet tall, but the war is over. Finally. Finally, the war is over. The Great Depression is over. And now communism seems to represent somebody who wants to take all that we've got away. So that was a big element of it. And then, in the West, had not forgotten the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where the Bolsheviks surrendered, well, basically surrendered to Germany. Germany could now turn against the Western Allies and nearly won in 2018. Did I say 2018? That's what we call foreshadowing. But in 1918. And then, Stalin was a horrible authoritarian dictator, as seen by the purges. Stalin did kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of former communists and army officers because they might be a threat. And his actions would be responsible for the death of millions of Soviets. He was a horrible authoritarian dictator. But does that mean that he's a threat to the United States? Well, he is a bad person. Next, he did sign that agreement with Hitler. The Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1938. And the idea is if he could do that, he could do anything. Cannot trust them. So they're always trying to figure out some angle, maybe to get more, to take more. And then at Yalta, they promised free elections. Poland was one of the biggest, because remember, Poland was where the war started. But in Eastern Europe, he promised free elections and didn't deliver. Now, this we saw as, see, he's creating Stalin's dictatorships in Eastern Europe because he plans on taking all the rest of Europe. He's going to take it all. And who knows where he'll stop? The Mideast? Asia? Wyoming? Where will he stop? And so, so with that, and so all of this was this action of this sinister force that cannot be trusted and trying to take over areas and never leave. And one thing about this, the US, and part of their fears, never understood how absolutely devastating the Soviet Union was in this war. Just destroyed. We never understood that. And so there's always this assumption was that they were this ultimate power because they defeated the Germans, but actually they were really weak and insecure. The Soviet fears, and by the way, these are supposed to be three capitalists from France, United States, and Britain, and they are on the rich off the bodies of workers. But the Soviet fears. The United States has always been anti-communist. Always. They've always hated us. Remember back in 1918, I told you about when the U.S. sent troops to intervene in the Civil War. Montanans even went up to Murmansk. Montana invaded the Soviet Union. No, to stop the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War in 1918. And if they invaded once, they'll do it again. So they've always been against us. They're always out to get us. And then the Russians and then the Soviets were not invited to Versailles or Munich. And they had not forgotten that. They always felt that they were being treated as second-class citizens, and the Western Allies only used them and used Soviet blood to defeat the Germans, and then they would discard them or undermine and destroy them down the road. And then, well, millions of Soviets died. The Western Allies never did a true second front until 1944. Now, even though Stalin was actually having second thoughts about that, to his point of view, this proves that they've always thought of us as nothing more as fodder for German guns. They'll kill against the Germans, and then they'll take over. And then, one more thing before I put that up there. Remember at Yalta, they promised reparations, and then Potsdam, no reparations from Germany. What was the U.S. aid to countries fighting aggression called again? Lend-Lease. The U.S. also promised Lend-Lease to the Soviets long after the war was over. The idea being there's a tacit acknowledgement of the suffering they went through to defeat the Germans. So we're going to continue to give them Lend-Lease. Well, two big things happened in 45 and 46. This 45 especially. The Soviets thought we were cutting off Lend-Lease and then would cut it off eventually, and no reparations. And to the Soviets, to Stalin, that proved every one of his fears. I knew it as soon as the war was over. Over 30 ships in a convoy were going over Norway on the way to Murmansk with Lend-Lease in May of 1945. When it was announced on May 7th, 1945, that the war was over, somebody in the Navy Department, this is Free Defense Department, ordered that convoy to turn around and go back to the U.S. And so for nearly 3 days, that convoy began steaming back towards the United Kingdom. Now, they realized the mistake and ordered it back. Stalin heard. To Stalin, that proved every one of his fears. I knew it. This was all an effort to weaken the Soviet Union after the war is over so they could destroy us. They hate us. Yes?
With Britain being such a small, country, how is it part of the big three?
Well, Britain had a big empire, a very wealthy country, just not as big as the other two countries. But they're totally broke by the war. And so by the end, they're no longer a great power, or power equal to the United States and the Soviet Union. Then they're absolutely convinced that they were going to rearm Germany and send them back. Just convinced of this. They want to make sure that there's going to be a government here that could never do it again. That's why Stalin was obsessed with a buffer zone. And looking back, this seems ridiculous, but to Stalin, not only did it not seem ridiculous, but the Germans helped him out. In Hitler's delusions, he still believed as late as April of 1945 that somehow the Western Allies would come to their senses and join Germany to defeat the real threat to mankind, Bolshevism. He believed that. The last big German offensive called the Battle of the Bulge, where they used up their last reserves to attack right here, Hitler thought this would force the West to realize their mistake and join them to defeat the communists. He just believed they'll eventually figure it out. And so to Stalin, that seemed to prove that could have happened. That seemed to prove his every fear. But looking back, it's patently ridiculous. But if you're the most paranoid man ever to live, it makes sense. And so you have this looking at every move. You have this situation where they're looking at every move with distrust. They must be up to something. And so then every time that would happen, it would be, told you so. I told you so. And so with that, I like this cartoon. First off, here's the divide of the alliance. But I like this one. It says, free Eastern governments. There's Stalin holding out, and then, what kind of dog, by the way? So, George. Oh, that's a good cartoon. And one more thing that would be part of American fears, but also really play into Soviet fears. Even though the US almost immediately started to disarm, 6 months after the atomic bomb was dropped, the US has more bombs. And they started a whole series of tests. Not just to see if the bomb could work and what they could be used for, but also to scare the Soviets. And these tests would be done at Bikini Atoll. But an army, Bikini Atoll is in the Marshall Islands, right here. And do you know what an atoll is? Yes, coral island is kind of like a, don't think like a one island, it's a bunch of small islands on a coral reef. And a lot of Marines died taking, we talking Kwajalein Atoll. But Bikini Atoll, they forced the people off and they did tests there. An army publicist was going to mention this and he misspelled bikini. And so that's where you get Bikini Atoll, because there's a misspelling. And they were going to test nuclear weapons out there, these atomic bombs. So they did one high in the atmosphere, about ground level. This is underground, or underwater, I'm sorry, to see what it would do to ships. So they got a bunch of World War II ships that are now obsolete, including some Japanese ones. And they wanted to see what happened to the ships. The idea being, what if it's an atomic-tipped torpedo? Wait,
so they like dropped it in the water?
No, it was under the water and they just exploded under the water. They didn't drop it. And some of the ships ripped the hulls out, but didn't do as much as they thought. But they also did a bunch of animals and tied them down to see what the radiation would do. Nah. Yes, they wanted to see what the bombs would work. And by the way, nobody realized how absolutely dangerous those bombs were. I don't mean just a nuclear bomb dangerous. I mean, as in they could have gone off at any time. They were so dangerous. Oh.
Didn't we completely ruin that time?
Oh yeah, it's just destroyed. Yeah, they would drop it. They would also do an hydrogen bomb. This is about 20 kilotons. They also put a 15 megaton or million ton.
What's more destructive, hydrogen bombs or?
Hydrogen bombs. They call it the super. And yes, it's true. There was a French designer who was making a new bathing suit to take advantage of the publicity for the explosions on Bikini Atoll that they misspelled to Bikini Atoll. In fact, here it is, the first bikini. He named it after that. Huh. So that's where the term comes from, which otherwise would be meaningless, especially since the word's made up. There's no place called bikini, but so while these, and we're going to do hundreds of tests of nuclear weapons. We're going to blow up much of Nevada. But it'd be a fun thing to watch the mushroom cloud while you go to Vegas. But anyways, peace would really collapse by 1946. And in 46, part of it was this effort by Truman, partially because of domestic politics. Truman by 46, the luster had come off. The war was over, and Truman now was very unpopular. In fact, it was really common to say Truman's an imbecile. How do we let this imbecile into office? And 3 years till the mistake could be rectified, kind of thing. So, there's James Burns, first Secretary of State. And Burns was also in a couple of the DBQs, he's mentioned a couple of the documents. Well, Here's what he said to Burns in 46. We've been too nice to them, and we're going to show we're tough. Now think about it. Stalin is going to think about this. Stalin's thinking to show they're tough because he's trying to destroy us. And Truman's going to say we're going to stand up to it partially for political reasons. And so, Truman is thinking we're going to stand up for being tough. Stalin is intensely paranoid. And there's one more thing. He doesn't want a direct confrontation with the U.S. over anything. The Soviet economy is in shambles. The people civilians in the Soviet Union are on starvation rations. They're out of food. I mean, it's just a nightmare there that will go on through the 50s into the 60s. They never really recovered. Of course, now it's Russia. I mean, it's still kind of never really recovered. But the key confrontational point is Germany. There are 4 occupation zones, but not that. Not just that. Berlin has 4 occupation zones, and it's the middle of the Soviet occupation zone, right there. There were 3 corridors for the British, the French, and the Americans. They were designated for supply. Basically, each of them had 1 railroad, and each had 1 highway. That was designated for their supply. It wasn't like cut off, just said that. These will be yours for the Americans. Each of them put a brigade of about 5,000 men. And then they also had, in each area, about 1 million civilians. And Stalin decided to use Berlin, since it's in the middle of that, as leverage. He wanted more reparations. He wanted more aid. He wanted more aid for this area here that was destroyed. Budapest was in ruins. Some of the hardest fighting of the war would happen there in early 1945. And so he started to play games with these road corridors. Like, for example, they would repair a bridge for a week, so they couldn't use a road into the British occupation zone. Just little things like that to try to push the Americans to act. And what did the Americans do? They played games with Lend-Lease. And that is when Stalin decided, okay, in 1946, he had his soldiers strip everything in the Eastern Zone, strip it all. Take everything. Take it all. Everything of value. And the U.S. responded by totally cutting off Lend-Lease. Now, when I mean take everything, I mean he had his men go in this part here, and anything that could potentially be valuable, they put it on trains and sent it back to the Soviet Union. So they combed through the ruins, and if there was a brick that was good, they shipped it back. Nails, boards, curtains, clothing, toilets, sinks, pipes. They even cut up chunks of the Autobahn, of cement, put it on flatbed cars, and shipped it back to the Soviet Union. By the way, what can you do with big chunks of cement? Yeah. Barely. They use some in some earthen dams, but then they just kind of dumped it. But they stripped everything. And then to the Americans, oh, they're stealing everything, and this is a precursor to them. Now they're going to try to get this area and steal. So the U.S. cut off aid. You could argue when the U.S. cut off Lend-Lease, that's really when the Cold War began in 46. And so now going into 1947, it really looked like to a lot in the West that the Soviets are pushing and trying to get more. And soon, even though he gets the credit, what would this line soon be called? Or as I think I wrote down, the Ron curtain. Oh, I like this cartoon. That's the buffer zone. Friendly states. We went friendly states, and then Stalin taking more and more land. The Ron curtain.
Yeah,
You barely make out the edge. Now, Churchill would be given credit for this. This is part of the speech he gave at a college in Missouri. I know. The former Prime Minister of Britain speaking in Missouri about communist-dominated states in Eastern Europe. Makes perfect sense, right?
Yeah.
Where he talked about from Stettin, so right here, down to Trieste. We'll all be behind this iron curtain of communist, Stalinist rule. And that's where the term Iron Curtain. So behind the Iron Curtain, etc. Now, this would actually become, you know, we could say the Iron Curtain, you know, Yugoslavia is not there. Yugoslavia had a communist dictatorship also, but they were liberated in 1945 by partisans homegrown in Yugoslavia under a guy by the name called himself Tito. And Stalin didn't control it. And they had a few conflicts in the late 1940s, kind of disagreements, and Yugoslavia would never come under Soviet domination. So they stayed this kind of communist place outside. When he died in 1980, they barely held on. And then in the 90s, the whole thing blew in civil war. One of the bloodiest civil wars of the last 50 years in Yugoslavia. But Iron Curtain, that's where the term comes from. And here is a famous cartoon of Churchill looking under the Iron Curtain. Get it? And look what's happening over here. What does it look like here? Industry and building and mobilizing. Wasn't like that. But one thing, the U.S. by 46 is pulling troops out. Yeah. Who's Joe? Joe Stalin. Joseph Stalin. Uncle Joe. Yeah. Just Joe. So the U.S. went from having nearly 12 million men and women in uniform to 1 million at 47. The U.S. is his army. And America wants out of Europe. So what will the future be? Will Britain and France be able to hold on to Western Europe? Or are the Soviets going to take it all? And in that matter, Italy. U.S. troops in their occupation zone down here in 46, these are men who were drafted and now the war is over. Why am I in the army? They actually began to riot. There were huge riots in American bases there. And Truman's like, okay, just get out. So we're pulling out. What are we going to lose? And Britain is completely broke. After the war, they're going to have to ration food for 13 years. They would lose almost all their colonies. Heck, they lost the biggie, 47. India. I mean, all these things that they thought they would save with their empire are falling apart. And Britain now is left all on their own. And that's what we come into. I'm adding Turkey to this because this is a little scam they play, but Greece and Turkey. There's a communist revolution in Greece. Actually, there was a civil war in Greece. Communist guerrillas were very active against the Nazis when Germany took over Greece in 1940. They actually did really well. But after the war, both Stalin and Churchill agreed that Greece would be in a British sphere of influence. Basically, what they agreed on is that, all right, Stalin's probably going to control this, but we want Greece. It's near the Suez Canal. It's near the Dardanelles, Greece. Britain was arming a really brutal military dictatorship in Greece. But they wanted influence. This dictatorship was fighting the communist guerrillas. But Britain couldn't afford it anymore. In 1947, they realized they're broke. They can't afford it. They can't afford this dictatorship. They just can't afford to give them weapons. And they're really worried that the Soviet Union might take Greece. And if they take Greece, Turkey and the Dardanelles right there. Russia has been eyeing this for years. There have been many Russo-Turkish wars. This goes back to Peter the Great trying to get that. And so, this is a map from Time magazine, and it's supposed to show the British-U.S. chain of interest. And you notice the chain has some breaks in it. Here. Can they hold here? Well, Britain can't do it. The U.S. is pulling out. They asked Truman, the United States, for aid. They want the United States to give weapons and aid to Greece. This dictatorship in Greece. Brutal dictatorship in Greece. But Truman has a problem. Truman is immediately sympathetic to that because he believes this communist dictatorship here, this cartoon, this map shows it pretty well. Who's really behind it? It's all Stalin. And if we let him win there, then Stalin will use that to keep going. And he didn't want to, what did we call giving into aggression? We don't want another mutiny. We don't want a peace. Yes.
So for the AP test, will we have to like write any strategies and like cartoons? Like that. Because I mean, we're never so that's
No. But things I just have no idea, but there's a chance, sure. There's a good chance your DBQ there'll be a document that's a legal cartoon. There's a good chance that
So we did give him aid.
well, we're not there yet. He's got to convince him, but there's a problem. In 1946, in the midterm election, Republicans, conservative Republicans took control of the House and the Senate. Actually, Republicans took control of the House and Senate, and then conservative Republicans and Democrats dominated. And they were intensely isolationist. It's the first time Republicans had it was a tiny majority, but a majority of both the House and the Senate since 1930. And you think about it, Democrats have been in charge for a long time, years of war, and they really push this idea that the Democrats have gotten complacent, we need a time for a change. And the thing is, they were intensely isolationist. Remember, the same thing happened after World War I. Conservative foreign policy wanted to pull back, no more intervention, no more wars. In fact, the Republicans were hoping to get rid of the New Deal. And so they didn't want to mess with anything with this. And so Truman said, okay, we're probably going to have to do this, but how does he deal with a Congress that is completely opposed to him? They want Truman to do badly, so he loses for re-election if he decides to run again in 1948. Truman didn't want to run again, but he kind of felt like he had to. And one more thing. What actually was Stalin doing? The whole thing was based upon this idea that Stalin was somehow behind it, and as it turned out, no. Stalin was actively discouraging the Greek communists. He did not want them to revolt. He did not want to revolt the United States, and he didn't control them. He didn't want another Tito. Like Yugoslavia, he didn't support them. So much of the policy was that Stalin was directing this. In reality, he wasn't. But remember, ignorance, don't know, don't understand. And this is going to lead to something. How does President Truman ask for a huge amount of aid against a Congress that's isolationist? How do you get them to do it? They don't want war. They don't want to get involved. They don't care about Greece. How do you do it? Yes. Something bad is happening. So what do you got to do? Stretch the tree. Scare the hell out of them. And exaggerate the communist threat so they feel like if we don't stop them in Greece, we'll be defending the shores of Wyoming. That is what you have to do. Huh? That's what they want you to believe. So, how do you get through a conservative Congress? You scare them to death. You say that the communists are coming to take you, to destroy you, unless we stop them in Greece. And look at Stalin cat. That is a terrifying cat. That's Western Europe. And you'll notice something else. Greece and Turkey. You imply that there's a communist revolution in Turkey when there wasn't one. But you say that they're already expanding. Turkey and Greece are going to fall. And if we don't stop them there, we will have to fight for ourselves here. We must stop them. So he greatly exaggerated the threat. Greatly exaggerated to make the very anti-communist Republican Party get away from their isolationist attitude to get involved in a very militaristic point of view. It all came, his overall policy was actually not a military policy, but it was called containment. George Kennan, Undersecretary of State, would write called the Long Letter, where he laid out what the United States has got to stop communism. And for the reason is, the Soviets are bent on destroying the world. Let's say destroying, I mean conquering the world. He said, communist goal is to eventually take over every country in the world. And if they're going to attack all over the world, we're going to have to stop them everywhere, aka contain the infection. So I love this from Time Magazine, The Communist Contagion. And it has here, that's quarantine, infected, exposed. But communism is a disease that people can contract. I'll come back to that disease reference in a second. But the whole idea is that, therefore, all we can do is try to stop it. But if that's the policy, we got to do it in Greece. And so he went to Congress and gave, here he is giving his speech on foreign policy. Remember the Monroe Doctrine? The Truman Doctrine. Now, the Truman Doctrine is not law. What it is a statement of American policy goals, or at least the president's policy goals. But this Truman Doctrine, you can see a moment when this became American policy, that everything changed. A complete 180-degree turn about America involved in the world and America in a standing army. Everything changed. And this would be the basis for the next 7 years. Let me check. It's still our policy, the basis today. I checked. Now, it ties in with containment. It ties in with containment. So make sure you have these kind of circled or something, yes.
So this is why we're involved. It's like a big reason why we're involved in the movies right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everywhere. But you're exact, it is. It is. And it starts with this basic idea. The first basic idea is this. Communism is not like any other enemy. It's an enemy of your belief, your value system. And it gets into you and changes you. So you get infected and your attitudes change. Oh, you look like everybody else. You act like everybody else, but there's something different about you. That's why they used to use disease all the time. It's ideological. And it's no coincidence that you're going to have this whole genre of sci-fi movies and horror movies of alien invasion, and others, they're communists. It's all communists. Communism coming in, this unknown changing thing. What does indivisible mean? Not divided. That means that one communist is the same as every other communist. A communist in Moscow is the same as a communist in Greece, the same as a communist in China, the same as a communist in Wyoming. Exactly. It's a perfect rectangle. So with that, as we all know, therefore, one communist is the same as everybody else. So we all know every country, they all have the same exact political and economic point of view, right?
Absolutely.
Hey, if you would have said, you know, there's really some very difficult geopolitical issues with Greece and its neighbors, and they have a dictatorship, and there's a lot of complex nuance. Is that scary? They're going to kill you. That's scary. And that's how they did it. That's how we did it, by greatly exaggerating it. And Keenan talked about the domino effect. You probably heard the domino theory. The domino effect. And what does that mean? Yeah, it'll go to all its neighbors. That's why the struggle could be anywhere. And then, wait a minute, how could Greece affect us? Well, if Greece and Turkey go, who's next? Italy? Wyoming? Italy, France, Britain, Ireland, Casper, Wyoming. Right? Who's been to Casper? Yeah, pretty cool, huh? Who's been to Gillette?
I think I've passed through it.
Who's been to Bill, Wyoming? You've been to Bill? Yeah. Between Douglas and Gillette, yeah? All right, so Wyoming. By the way, to believe this idea, you have to believe that the same situation that's affecting Greece, that means the situation that's affecting Greece is the same as in Italy. It's the same as in France. You have to believe that they're all the same. It's somehow interrelated. And therefore, the world is now simple. It's a bipolar world. All conflicts in reality are just a conflict with the US and the Soviet Union. Has everyone got that? All conflicts are just that. The US versus the Soviet Union. Simple, isn't it? You don't have to think then. All you know is it's us versus them. The free world versus the enslaved world. Red versus blue. All the maps when I was a kid, this was always red and this was always green. Did I say green? Blue. And I found this very disconcerting. Is orange and green? Come on, it's supposed to be blue against red. All the maps were like that, I guess with no water. And so, lastly, that means that every revolt, every war, anything that the United States sees that's going against its interests, it's all being directed from the Kremlin. All of it. We had this vision of Joe Stalin sitting there with his pipe, with a big map of the world. Puffing on his pipe, pointing out places like, today we'll attack Greece. And then we'll have a strike in Tokyo. And then we'll attack in Egypt. And then what's next? Laramie. Pretty cosmopolitan, aren't you? And this cartoon is Stalin and his foreign minister Molotov, and these are all country names. And they're basically spinning the globe, and that's where we're going to hit next. You hit a dial, revolution. Like that's all it takes. If Stalin would say revolution, all of a sudden people will go fight and die for that. Yeah.
What was this person? Stalin's first name?
Joseph Stalin?
What was his other Joe?
Who's the guy spinning the globe?
Oh, that's Molotov, his foreign minister.
Molotov.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, it's named after him. No, it is. Molotov cocktails are named after Molotov. Yeah. Because he was a Soviet foreign minister. So here's the point. That's where they were first used. Okay. So that's American foreign policy to this day. You take out communism and put out whoever the enemy of the day is, you got American foreign policy today. For most of your life, just replace communism with what? Well, terrorism, it might be. That's your enemy. They're everywhere, so we got to bomb everywhere, right? If we let them take over Somalia, Wyoming's next, right? So we're bombing Somalia. Yes. Yes, we're in Syria. We're in Somalia. We're in Yemen. We're in Iraq. We're in Afghanistan. We're in Niger. We're in Nigeria. We're in Chad. If we don't stop them there. I know Syria, but everywhere.
Don't we have 800 military?
No. If you count the small bases, we have over 900.
But the rest of the world combined, and they have like that are military.
It's a totally different world.
Do you think the world is going to end on Wednesday?
Why would it end on
Heard
Wednesday?
about that?
Oh, yeah.
There's this theory, this guy got this voicemail, and it's like a military alphabet code, and it's like, they think it's like it has coordinates at the end, and it's saying like danger, they're not human anywhere, and then it has coordinates at the end, and it comes from like near where that Malaysian flight went missing, so they think it's like the black box recording being with aliens, and like they're gonna come kill us on something.
Oh, yeah. This project's really dependent on
What time?
We don't know.
Because I'm starting in class.
I watched a video on it.
Yes.
When would you like to come and take the DVD?
You do after school today. Okay, good.
Christy watched a video on it.
Oh, okay. I know. Yeah, been through there many times. I know. I only. Well, Wednesday's not. We got a little bit of time. Travel, see the world.
Articles due to there.
Tomorrow, I don't know if anybody is done after we finish watching the movie.
I found like the first
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I was in there.
Awesome.
I tried, my printer went right in black and white. I was all in color. I was just like, what is wrong with this?
And you have it's all printed? Oh, good. We're gonna watch a little bit. We're gonna talk a little bit more about War of the Worlds. Yeah, there's someone spilled a bottle of water and it just seems to be growing. Yeah.
Did you see that?
Where did they spill it?
Right.
Hey,
Right, right.
I think you're gonna backtrack.
Don't you gonna be-
Yeah, go eat some paper towels. You're good people.
Where's this water?
Somebody spilled a bottle of water and I guess it was a lot more than we everyone thought.
So like in Mr. Partridge, we don't share the like